The Galactic Union of Sentient Species had a problem, and that problem was approximately 149.6 million kilometers from a rather unremarkable yellow star in the Orion Cygnus arm. That problem had fur-feather scales and an alarming tendency to either reproduce exponentially or die dramatically at the most inconvenient moments. The problem, of course, was Earth, not the humans themselves. Mind you, no, they were manageable enough. Enthusiastic, curious, occasionally belligerent, but generally well-meaning, despite their baffling obsession with creating increasingly complex ways to combine sugar and fat. The real issue was their fauna, which the rest of the galactic community had learned through a series of increasingly disastrous events should never under any circumstances be transported off-world. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Every catastrophic diplomatic incident has its origins, and this one began with what the Union's historians now refer to as the welcoming ceremony debacle, though, in less formal circles, it's simply called the day everything went to. The Galactic Union had been observing Earth for millennia, watching as humans evolved from cave-dwelling primates with a concerning predilection for hitting things with rocks into spacefaring. Primates with a concerning predilection for hitting things with lasers when humans finally developed faster-than-light travel, admittedly by accident after an experimental coffee machine merged with a quantum computing array. The Union agreed it was time to make first contact. The Union prided itself on its welcoming protocols. New species were to be eased into the galactic community through a series of carefully orchestrated ceremonies and cultural exchanges. These traditions had been refined over 50,000 years and had successfully integrated over 600 species. Without major incident, the protocols were especially clear. On one point, the exchange of biological specimens was a sacred trust, symbolizing the sharing of evolutionary heritage. Every species brought gifts of their planet's flora and fauna to demonstrate both their biodiversity and their technological prowess in maintaining these life forms in varied environments. The Vex of Riel 7 had presented crystalline lichens that converted radiation into pleasing musical tones. The gelatinous Morb Collective had gifted bioluminescent algae that could spell out poetry in 26 languages. Even the notoriously pragmatic Z had managed to impress with their telekinetic fungi, which could assemble themselves into rudimentary but surprisingly accurate fortune-telling devices. Humans eager to make a good impression assembled what they considered their most impressive collection of Earth's creatures, a delegation of xenobiologists, diplomats, and one suspiciously enthusiastic Australian who had somehow talked his way onto the mission roster, arrived at Union headquarters on Alpha Centauri Prime with sealed containers of what they called Earth's most unique and adaptable species, Ambassador Xylith of the Cephalon. Directorate A being composed primarily of neural tissue, suspended in an elegant hovering shell, greeted the human delegation in the Grand Exchange Chamber. Present were representatives from all major Union powers: the insectoid, the energy-based luminary, the silicon-formed Petra Collective, and dozens of other species whose names humans couldn't pronounce without significant reconstructive surgery to their vocal cords. We welcome our Terran friends. Xylith's translation matrix conveyed with perfect diplomatic neutrality, and invite you to present your biological offerings to the Union. This tradition dates back to the first convergence and symbolizes the trust and openness that forms the foundation of our galactic community. The human ambassador, a distinguished diplomat who had spent years preparing for this moment, stepped forward with appropriate solemnity on behalf of Earth and all humanity. We are honored to present specimens that represent the diversity and resilience of our planetary ecosystem. At this point, the Australian who had been fidgeting throughout the formal proceedings shouldered his way to the front. Yeah, and wait till you see. What we brought, these little beauties will knock your various sensory appendages right off. What followed was a presentation that started with relatively benign offerings a collection of butterflies whose wings had been genetically modified to display messages of peace in various Union languages, some particularly hardy succulents, and a tank of colorful reef fish that elicited appreciative murmurs from the assembled dignitaries. Then came what the humans called the main attractions. This announced the Australian holding up a sealed habitatus, a pair of rabbits, cute, fluffy, and the most efficient reproductive system on our planet. They can have up to 12 babies every month, and those babies can start having their own babies in just a few months. Amazing, right? The Union representatives exchanged concerned glances. The Tongue Creek Queen, diplomat's antenna, twitched nervously, and here, continued another scientist, oblivious to the growing unease. We have mosquito eggs. These little guys can adapt to almost any environment with standing water. They're part of Earth's disease vector control research. We've modified them to deliver vaccines instead of spreading illness. A low hum of alarmed subvocal communications spread through the chamber. Oh, and check these out. The Australian added, presenting another container cockroaches. These blighters can survive almost anything: radiation, starvation, you name it. We've got a few different species here. The big ones are from my apartment building back in Sydney. The Luminari representative actually dimmed in horror, but the piece de resistance, the lead xenonoiologist, said proudly, is this collection of extriophile microorganisms from Earth's most hostile environments. We have bacteria from volcanic vents that eat sulfur, arca from salt flats that can survive complete desiccation, and tardigrades that can live in the vacuum of space. At this point, Ambassador Xylith's hovering shell had risen nearly a meter higher than its usual diplomatic position, the cephalon equivalent of backing away slowly with hands raised. These microscopic wonders demonstrate the incredible adaptability of Earth life, the scientist continued enthusiastically. We've even brought some engineered variants that can break down plastics, consume radioactive waste, and rapidly terraform inhospitable environments. It was at precisely this moment that one of the rabbit habitats supposedly secured with Earth's most advanced containment technology experienced what would later be described in the incident report as an unforeseen structural compromise. In layman's terms, the latch broke as the first rabbit made a dash for freedom. Across the hallowed floor of the Grand Exchange Chamber, the Australian helpfully announced, "No worries, these little guys are completely harmless unless you're a vegetable garden. Of course, then you're proper stuffed." The Galactic Union would soon discover just how prophetic those words were. The escaped rabbit, later identified in Union security records as Specimen R7, but informally known as the Harbinger, was only the beginning of what would become a cascade of increasingly catastrophic biological incidents. Within hours of the ceremonial exchange, reports began flooding in from various sections of Alpha Centauri Prime's diplomatic quarter. The first came from the hydroponic symphony garden, where the Vex ambassador discovered small, fluffy creatures devouring a collection of rare singing plants that had been cultivated over 3 centuries. They're just eating the vegetation. The human representative assured the emergency response team once they run out of plants, we'll easily round them up. This statement displayed a profound misunderstanding of both rabbit metabolism and the concept of running out the hydroponics. Garden contained precisely the ideal conditions for lagomorph populations to thrive: abundant food, no predators, and conveniently porous ventilation systems that allowed them to spread throughout the station's agricultural sectors by the following. Morning Union botanists estimated that 17 different species of extraterrestrial flora had been consumed to extinction, including the famed thinking roses of Aldebaran, which had been used for 13 millennia in empathic meditation practices. Meanwhile, in the atmospheric processing section, environmental engineers made a disturbing discovery. The mosquito eggs, which had supposedly been sealed in specialized containment fields, had somehow been released into the station's water reclamation system. The genetically modified Earth insects, designed to thrive in diverse conditions, had found the humid, nutrient-rich environment of the processing plants irresistibly hospitable. Not to worry. explained the human entomologist. These mosquitoes are harmless to most species. They're programmed to deliver beneficial compounds through their bite. What the entomologist failed to consider was that beneficial compounds designed for human biochemistry might have radically different effects on alien physiologies. The first report came from a Tenri maintenance worker who, after being bitten, developed an immediate and alarming reaction: the spontaneous growth of human-like hair across its exoskeleton. That Zen Cree hive responded by immediately placing all affected workers in quarantine. But it was too late. The modified mosquito genetic material interacted unpredictably with the insectoid species, highly mutable DNA, resulting in a subset of workers who began exhibiting disquing mammalian characteristics. The affected Zekri reportedly began requesting blankets expressing emotions, and in one particularly troubling case, attempting to nurse their Levi the Zenri Queen diplomat, filed the first of what would eventually be 76 formal complaints against Earth's biological containment protocols. As for the cockroaches, they proved themselves worthy of the humans' enthusiastic endorsement of their survival capabilities within days. They had established colonies in 12 different sections. Message transmitted simultaneously to 17 Union worlds was send more moss. The emergency committee convened by the Union Council faced a situation without precedent. One member, a representative of the ancient and usually unflappable Petra Collective, summarized the situation with uncharacteristic emotion. The humans have not presented us with specimens. They have unleashed biological weapons of a subtlety and efficiency that our most paranoid security analysts could never have envisioned. The human delegation's increasingly desperate assurances that everything is under control became less convincing with each new development. The Australians' helpful suggestion to just bring in some dingoes to take care of the rabbits was met with the kind of silence that transcends species boundaries in its profound disapproval. The Union's preliminary damage assessment report, normally a dry document filled with bureaucratic language and precise quantification of resources lost, contained an unprecedented editorial comment in its conclusion in retrospect, allowing a species that evolved on a death world where every organism has developed extraordinary survival mechanisms to share its biology with the wider galaxy represents a lapse in judgment of cosmic proportions. Meanwhile, the rabbits continued their relentless reproduction by the end of the first week. Station security had captured exactly 43 specimens, while estimating the total population at over 600, the head of containment operations. A veteran of 3 interstellar conflicts was discovered in a supply closet, rocking back and forth and muttering calculations about exponential growth curves. The mosquito situation deteriorated further when it was discovered that the insects had adapted to feed on the biochemical fluid used in the station's organic computing systems. The affected systems began producing results with inexplicable errors, specifically a tendency to add human-centric observational commentary to objective data. The central navigation computer, when asked to calculate a standard orbital correction, responded with the technically accurate coordinates followed by, "But have you considered how weird it is that we all just float around in space without falling down?" As for the tardigrades, their evolution continued at an alarming pace. Their communications grew increasingly sophisticated, progressing from send more moss to philosophical inquiries about the nature of existence, culminating in what xenolinguists tentatively identified as existential poetry about the ephemeral beauty of water droplets. And all of this, regrettably, occurred before any of the Earth's specimens had been transferred to other worlds, the Galactic Union, an organization that had weathered countless crises over 50 millennia of existence, faced a new and unprecedented threat. Adorable, fluffy creatures with a proclivity for explosive reproduction, insects capable of hijacking alien DNA, and microscopic organisms evolving towards sentience at speeds that defied comprehension. As an emergency quarantine protocol was initiated around the diplomatic station, the Union High Council issued a preliminary directive that would later form the foundation of the most comprehensive biological Containment policy in galactic history, its opening line, later quoted in xenobiology textbooks across the galaxy, reads simply, "Regarding Earth biology, everything is more dangerous than it appears." Little did they know, the true catastrophe was just beginning. If the incidents on Alpha Centauri Prime represented the opening act of this interstellar farce, what followed was a full-blown catastrophe of cosmic proportions, complete with an ensemble cast of invasive Earth species and a galaxy-wide audience of increasingly horrified sentient beings, despite the initial problems, or perhaps because Union officials naively believed the situation had been contained. The ceremonial exchange of biological specimens preceded representatives from 17 major Union species accepted carefully selected Earth animals as diplomatic gifts, each chosen to match the environmental conditions of their home worlds. The aquatic consortium of Proxima Centauri b received a pair of udders, which the humans described as playful aquatic mammals that form strong social bonds. What they failed to mention was the otter's extraordinary talent for tool use and their insatiable curiosity about underwater machinery, a combination that led to the systematic dismantling of the consortium's tidal regulation system. Within a week, they're just exploring their environment, explained the human xenobiologist assigned to monitor the situation. This was cold comfort to the consortium elders when 3 of their primary underwater cities experienced what official reports diplomatically termed unscheduled buoyancy events, but which witnesses described more accurately as everything suddenly floating to the surface in pieces. The desert-dwelling Jakari were presented with a mated pair of fenk foxes described as perfectly adapted to arid conditions. The Jakari were initially charmed by the animals' oversized ears and elegant movements. This admiration faded when the foxes escaped bred with the local wildlife and produced hybrid offspring that could dig through solid rock and developed a taste for the sacred fungi that formed the basis of Jakari religious practices. The resulting spiritual crisis triggered by the sudden disappearance of fungi believed to have grown continuously. For 12,000 years led to the collapse of 3 major Jakari theological schools and the emergence of a new apocalyptic cult centered around the great devourers with the adorable ears. Troublingly, membership in this cult grew faster than efforts to contain the fox population. The methane-breathing Volra of Barnard's star received genetically modified extriophile bacteria intended to improve their atmosphere processing. Within months, the bacteria had evolved to consume methane at such an accelerated rate that the Volra were forced to evacuate 3 of their largest settlement domes due to atmospheric depletion. The bacteria are exceeding expected efficiency parameters, noted the human microbiology team with what the Volulra considered inappropriate. Scientifics. Enthusiasm 1. Volra elder forced to abandon an ancestral home dating back 40 generations, responded with a gesture that required no translation across species boundaries involving appendages, arranged in a configuration that would have been anatomically impossible for humans. But perhaps the most dramatic incident involved the gift to the luminary, a collection of deep-sea bioluminescent fish genetically enhanced to produce more vibrant light displays. The humans thought this an appropriate gift for energy-based beings who communicated partially through light patterns. What nobody anticipated was that the specific frequency of light produced by these modified fish would trigger reproductive behaviors in the luminary. The resulting population boom, the first in over 10,000 years for the slow reproducing species, created an unprecedented energy crisis in the luminary home system as thousands of newborn energy beings competed for resources. The luminary ambassador's formal message to the Union Council was both succinct and pointed. We have 17 drowned children. We did not plan for Earth will help raise them. When the human delegation delicately inquired what raising energy-based life forms might entail, the luminary representative replied, they require specific wavelength emissions and exotic particle sustainment for approximately 200 of your years, we have prepared detailed requirements for the establishment of 17 new stellar engineering facilities to be constructed and maintained at Earth's expense. The estimated cost represented, approximately, 3 times Earth's entire economic output. The human ambassador's attempt to suggest alternative childcare arrangements was met with a luminosity increase that temporarily blinded everyone in the diplomatic chamber. Meanwhile, the rabbits continued their conquest. Despite containment efforts, specimens had been inadvertently transported to 7 different worlds the colony established on Proxima. became particularly problematic when it was discovered that the local vegetation contained compounds that extended Therabits' lifespans 3-fold while doubling their reproductive rate. The affected region was eventually quarantined and designated a terrestrial biological disaster zone after Therabit population reached an estimated 1 billion. Satellite imagery from the quarantine zone showed an undulating mass of fur that periodically formed. What ecological pattern analysts disturbing identified as organized formations and possibly alphabetical shapes the lead containment specialist. After viewing the footage requested immediate reassignment to the considerably safer task of neutralizing unstable dark matter, the cockroaches for their part demonstrated an unanticipated talent for space travel hiding in cargo containers' personal belongings, and in one documented case, the ceremonial headdress of a Turn ambassador. They established footholds on 23 planets and 47 space stations on the silicon-rich world of the Petra Collective. They evolved to incorporate silicon compounds into their exoskeletons, resulting in cockroaches that were not only virtually indestructible, but also semi-transparent and capable of refracting light, a development that the human scientists described as fascinating, and the Petra described as an abomination before nature. The Petra, normally a stolid and contemplative species whose members might spend decades considering the philosophical implications of a single pebble, demonstrated unprecedented alarm when discovering that the silicon-enhanced cockroaches had begun constructing miniature versions of Petra religious monuments. Even more disturbing was the roaches' tendency to arrange themselves in formations that mimicked Petra writing systems, spelling out messages that crypto-linguists reluctantly translated as "more crumbs, please, and your technology is delicious." The mosquitoes continued their campaign of inadvertent genetic modification on the Tunri homeworld. An entire sub-hive developed. Mammalian characteristics seceded from the main collective and demanded recognition as a new species with the right to express individual emotions and wear tiny sweaters during cold seasons. The diplomatic complications were substantial, particularly when the modified Sincree began applying for individual citizenship status and requesting accommodations for their newly developed preference for personal space and emotional validation concepts previously unknown in Tinkree society cross-species. Psychologists reported the unprecedented emergence of insectoid existential crises, with affected individuals questioning their role in the collective and expressing desire for careers in creative fields. Most concerning of all was the discovery that the quantum evolved. Tardigrades had begun hitchhiking on interstellar communications, transferring themselves as encoded patterns through the Union's network and rematerializing at receiver stations. They established colonies in quantum communication, arrays across 17 systems, and seemed to be developing distinct cultural identities, with some groups sending increasingly complex philosophical inquiries, while others primarily requested different varieties of moss and engaged in what xenobiologists tentatively identified as poetry about water droplets. Particularly troubling development occurred when a group of tardigrades infiltrated the Union's central archives and began systematically reorganizing the classification system according to what they transmitted was a more aesthetically pleasing and moisture-optimized arrangement. While technically more efficient, the new system incorporated inexplicable categories such as documents that sound like water droplets when read aloud and Information with moss-like textural qualities, the Union's Xenobiological Containment Division, a previously underfunded agency that had dealt primarily with occasional outbreaks of spore-based smuggling, suddenly found itself elevated to emergency status. Its director, a multi-limbed being known for unflappable calm during previous minor crises, was recorded emerging from an emergency council session muttering, "They brought rabbits." Of all the species in their biosphere, they chose the rabbits before, dissolving into a peculiar clicking sound identified by colleagues as hysterical laughter. The director's subsequent memo to staff began with the ominous line, "Effective immediately. All personnel are to consider every Earth organism regardless of size, apparent harmlessness, or adorable physical characteristics as a potential Class 9 biological threat for context." The only previously designated Class 9 threat had been the consciousness, altering spores of the no-extinct Rigelian mind forests. As the crisis escalated, human representatives found themselves increasingly isolated in diplomatic circles. Invitations to cultural events dwindled, trade negotiations mysteriously stalled. At interspecies gatherings, humans would enter rooms to find conversations suddenly shifting to innocuous topics. The xenobiological equivalent of weather discussions, perhaps most telling, was the new safety protocol instituted at Union facilities. Proximity alarms that activated whenever human visitors approached sensitive environmental systems. The official explanation cited standard precautionary measures, but the alarm's unofficial designation as the Terran Containment Alert revealed its true purpose. The Australian who had enthusiastically introduced the rabbits became something of a galactic pariah. His name entered the lexicon of multiple species as a synonym for catastrophic misjudgment among the Sun. The phrase, pulling an Australian, came to mean creating a problem vastly worse than the one you were trying to solve in a desperate attempt to improve their standing. The human delegation proposed a solution. Earth predator species could be introduced to control the out-of-control Earth prey species. This suggestion was met with the diplomatic equivalent of a collective scream. "Let me clarify our proposal," the human ambassador explained to the emergency session of the Union Council. "We could introduce specialized predator species, cats, for instance, which have evolved specifically to hunt small mammals such as rabbits." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of 17 different species simultaneously activating their emergency translators to ensure they had not misunderstood. "You propose," the cephalon representative finally responded, each word precisely measured to address the catastrophic introduction of one Earth species by introducing another Earth species, perhaps one with predatory instincts, territorial behavior, and if our xenobiological briefings are accurate, a tendency to hunt for recreation, rather than sustenance. Cats are really quite harmless. The ambassador insisted there's small domesticated, and our records, interrupted the Volra delegate, indicate that these cats have contributed to the extinction of approximately 63 avian species on your own planet. They are classified as one of the most effective invasive predators in your world's history. The human ambassador's protest that these would be specially trained cats was met with what diplomatic historians later described as the most synchronized expression of cross-species. Incredule ever recorded the Union Council's response, delivered after an emergency session lasting 72 hours, was uncharacteristically blunt. Under no circumstances are any additional Earth organisms to be transported off-world. The introduction of Earth predators to control Earth prey would be akin to extinguishing a plasma fire by introducing a quantum singularity as 17 worlds continued their battle against unexpectedly resilient Earth biology. A growing sentiment emerged across the Union. Perhaps the most dangerous organism from that distant blue planet wasn't any of the gifted species, but rather the well-intentioned bipeds who had brought them in the first place. The official classification of Earth in the Union's Xenobiological Threat Database was updated from Standard Biological Diversity to Evolutionary Pressure Cooker Approach with Extreme Caution, an unofficial addendum widely circulated among Union officials, but never formally adopted, suggested a more accurate classification. Might be every living thing is either trying to eat everything, reproduce exponentially, or both. The human diplomatic corps found little comfort in the fact that, technically speaking, this assessment was entirely accurate. The galactic union of sentient species had existed for over 50,000 years, navigating wars, natural disasters, and the occasional reality-altering anomaly without resorting to extreme measures. In all that time, only 3 formal prohibitions had been enacted Theban on unconstrained artificial intelligence after the machine uprising of Sirius Prime, the moratorium on recreational time travel following the Grandfather Paradox pandemic, and the restrictions on weaponizing black holes which had been imposed after an incident that had technically never happened because the affected sector of spacetime had been cauterized from existence. The 4th prohibition was ratified unanimously with Earth's representative, abstaining only after receiving a meaningful glare from every other species present. The transportation of terrestrial fauna beyond the Sol system is henceforth prohibited under penalty of extreme sanctions. The formal document, extending to 700 pages of precise legal language, went on to specify that these sanctions could include economic isolation, cessation of technological exchange, and, in cases of deliberate violation, mandatory education sessions. About responsible xenobiology conducted by the Volra Ethics Committee, the last being widely considered the most severe punishment in the known galaxy. An appendix listing the banned organisms began with Orctogus cuniculus European rabbit and all lagomorph relatives and ended somewhat ominously with all terrestrial microorganisms, without exception, regardless of claims of beneficial properties, industrial applications, or alleged cuteness. The ban's implementation was immediate and thorough. Special containment protocols were established for human diplomatic vessels requiring 3 separate decontamination procedures before docking at any Union facility. Human travelers underwent what they considered invasively thorough scanning, including the notorious quantum cellular residue analysis that left the subject smelling faintly of cinnamon 4 days afterward on Earth itself, the reaction to becoming the only planet in known space whose indigenous wildlife was classified as a galactic. Security threat ranged from indignation to embarrassment. The scientific community, initially defensive, gradually came to acknowledge what they termed certain oversights in cross-species biological risk assessment. The Australian who had introduced the rabbits published a best-selling memoir titled How I Accidentally Invaded the Galaxy with Bunnies, which was subsequently banned in 17 Union jurisdictions as dangerous radical literature. Meanwhile, the Union launched what would become the most extensive biological containment effort in its history. The Xenobiological Containment Division now expanded to encompass nearly a quarter of the Union's operational budget coordinated efforts. I note with considerable relief that it is not alive we've learned our lesson. The human replied with a self-deprecating smile. Though I must tell you we've recently made fascinating breakthroughs in synthetic biology that the cephalon's shell rose a full meter higher, the diplomatic equivalent of raising both hands in alarm. Perhaps it suggested gently some lessons are best remembered in their original form across the vast expanse of the Union on-worlds orbiting countless stars' descendants. Of the original rabbits, cockroaches, and mosquitoes continued, their unlikely existence a persistent reminder that of all the unexpected things humanity had brought to the galactic community. Perhaps the most significant was a new appreciation for evolutionary caution when asked about Earth wildlife at xenobiology conferences. Union experts still responded with a phrase that had entered multiple languages: harmless individually, catastrophic collectively, and absolutely never to be underestimated. The quantum tardigrades, for their part, had evolved into a collective intelligence spanning 17 systems and had recently petitioned for full Union membership. Their application included a request for diplomatic relations with Earth provided all representatives arrive bearing appropriate quantities of premium moss varieties. They remained the only Earth organisms officially welcomed in Union space a distinction. They celebrated by composing quantum poetry about water droplets that somehow, inexplicably always, included subtle references to rabbits.